Hey, we're back to Lick of the Week videos. This is video 2 in the Formatting Banjo series, which is a little quirky title I came up with to kind of describe what we're talking about in this short video series. And that is, we're trying to look at and examine the banjo's job through an entire song. The first video we looked at the introduction, which also wound up being our first solo. So the banjo introduced the song, did the kickoff, which wound up being an entire solo. Now we're working on the verses of the song. So what we got to determine here in our little virtual experiment is what instrument will be backing up the vocalist on verse number 1. Since this is my virtual band and I can do what I want, I'm going to determine that the mandolin player will be the instrument actively backing up the first verse of the song. Now, to me, in my mind, I divide backup into passive and active. Passive being that you're a strong member of the rhythm section and you're not seeking to do any kind of fancy licks in the background. Basically, in a traditional setting, that means you'd be vamping behind the mandolin player and staying away from exotic rolls or syncopated patterns other than vamp patterns. Active backup would be actively seeking to play fill areas in the vocal, and that's what the banjo will eventually do in this song when we get to that point. But right now we're trying to figure out what can we do behind the mandolin player as he plays his active backup. So what we want to be conscious of is that we don't step on the mandolin player's toes, which means we don't want to be playing fancy Scruggs licks all over the neck, playing complicated syncopated roll patterns while the mandolin player is trying to play fills, because that totally distracts the listener. It's too busy. It probably bothers the mandolin player. The audience doesn't know who to listen to, so that's where you fall back to a supportive role and you seek to passively become a help to the mandolin player. So what I'm going to do is try to vamp, and since the verses and the choruses have the same melody, it doesn't really matter, but this is the first verse, so we're imagining that the mandolin player is playing active backup behind the vocalist, which means he's going to get those fill areas between vocal lines. So we need to be careful that we don't play too many fancy licks ever behind the mandolin when he's playing, but especially not in the same holes, because there'll be holes in the verses, which we'll examine here, that you don't want to fill with banjo stuff because the mandolin player is looking to do that. So let's take the first verse of the song. I went down to the river and I laid down to sleep. I went down to the river and I laid down to sleep. I went down to the river and I laid down to sleep. When I woke up, I had shackles on my feet. Okay, now that was just straight vamping. A lot of going back and forth between chord shapes. And that way, you know, I noticed I didn't do any rolls or any licks of any kind. I know that I'm not going to do anything that would mess with the mandolin player's mind as he tries to play, or distract the listener from what the vocalist and the mandolin player are doing, because they're the two featured persons in the band at this point. Now let's examine some of the holes where maybe we could have put something in, but we chose not to because the mandolin player would choose those exact same holes. Again, the first verse, I'll slow it down a little bit. I went down to the river and I laid down to sleep. Hole. Granted, there's not much of a hole there, but there's an area where the vocalist will generally take a breath. I went down to the river and I laid down to sleep. If you time that lick correctly, you know, if you come in just a hair earlier than I did, you can actually sneak a lick in. But that's also probably a spot where the mandolin player will decide to do a lick. So if you don't have an arrangement as a band where you know exactly where the mandolin player is going to play his fills, and you're not sure where you should play a lick, the rule is always less is more. So if you're not sure that the lick you're about to play is going to be in the same fill area as the mandolin player, don't do it. So I'm going to opt for just vamps here, but that's the first hole in the vocals where you can put a fill. I went down to the river and I laid down to sleep. You know, you'll have to sneak it in a little early. I lay down to sleep to make it fit. but that's probably the same place as the mandolin. But again, we're just looking at the holes. I went down to the river, I lay down to sleep. I should have started that earlier, but again, kind of hard to sing and do this at the same time. But what you're getting the gist of this, I think, is there's predetermined holes in the vocals for little licks, but the mandolin player is probably going to fill those holes. I lay down to the river, I went down to the river, I lay down to sleep. When I woke up, I had shackles on my feet. That's a big hole there at the end of that verse. Again, probably where the mandolin player would decide to do his backup. Okay, now let's pretend that the second verse is coming up and they want, I don't know, the fiddle player to play fills on the second verse. And again, this is my virtual band, so I can do what I want. But in your little world, you may want the banjo to play fills there. But you know, we'll examine this from my perspective. So for the fiddle, when the fiddle comes in, it's typical in a traditional setting for the banjo to be a little more active behind the fiddle player. So they may want you to roll a little more, not play a lot of really complicated licks, because again, you'll be distracting from the audience listening to the fiddle player. But I'm going to choose to play some rolling patterns behind the fiddle player. So the second verse of the song is coming up, and now I'm going to choose to back up the fiddle player who is backing up the verse. So I want to find some nice roll patterns. So I'm just going to choose some maybe major 6 roll patterns at the start of verse 2. To imagine that the fiddle player is playing backup licks, and since I don't have a live fiddle player here with me to force me to think as I play, I'm having to imagine what his fills would sound like and find complementary roll patterns. You notice I didn't do a lot of really complex rolls. I had a few little ideas in there, the boogie woogie lick. But again, let's pretend like the fiddle player is playing, and maybe I'll do some rolls behind the fiddle player. Now that would be an example of low rolling backup, concentrating on just playing nice generic sounding rolls, playing the chords of the song as the fiddle plays his backup. Okay, this would be another example. Again, the fiddle is playing the backup actively, and I'm trying to support him as he supports the vocalist. Let me try some different approaches. Trying to get a little more creative rhythmically, syncopating the patterns a little differently. But obviously, if you don't have a real band to play with, then you have to guess at what you might play. But when you do these things in real time, you have to adjust what you do to what you hear other people do. In a band situation, you would definitely have an arrangement where you would know exactly what you're supposed to be doing in every part of the song. But so this will be the conclusion of video 2, and what you can do is try different vamp patterns, imagining that the mandolin player is playing, or maybe you have a real mandolin player that you can try this out on, and try to get creative with your vamps and your rhythm to complement what the mandolin player is doing. And then maybe on the second verse you can use my example as the fiddle player playing the backup and rolling behind the fiddle player. But see what you can do with that. Hope it helps, and we'll see you in video 3. Appreciate it.